there's kind of this belief in the trauma field that you have to process the trauma before you're able to then connect and experience pleasure with others. And the opposing perspective is that when you experience pleasure and connection with the others, you're taking a risk. And taking risks enables you to overcome some of the constriction that trauma brings.
Welcome to the Stay Grounded podcast. I'm your host, Raj Jana, co-founder at Liberate, and it's my mission to help you become the most grounded, loving, and authentic version of yourself that you can be. Each week, I interview guests in the fields of mindset, spirituality, and emotional well-being. My brilliant guests share their tools, tips, and unique perspectives to help you develop the skills you need to show up for the people that matter most in your life. Now let's dive in. Hey guys, and welcome to this very special episode of Stay Grounded with the most incredible Dr. Jack Saul. So I'm going to read some of Jack's bio before I dive into what I love about him and what you guys are going to learn in this very special episode. Recorded in Costa Rica, so you're going to hear noises and birds chirping and cars rolling by, but I've been wanting to record this conversation with Dr. Jack for some time now, and we just weren't going to lose the opportunity. So Dr. Jack Saul is the founding director of the International Trauma Studies Program, a research and training institute based in New York City. This program is committed to enhancing the natural resilience and coping capacities in individuals, families, and communities that have endured and or are threatened by traumatic events. He has served on the faculties of New York University School of Medicine, Department of Psychiatry, the New School for Social Research Clinical Psychology Program, and Columbia University Mailman School of Public Health. As a psychologist and family therapist, he has created a number of clinical and community-based programs in NYC and abroad for populations that have endured disaster, war, torture, and political violence. When I first met Jack, he blew me away. One, because at Liberate, I'm constantly looking for different frameworks and programs and thought processes to empower peer support, which is what I personally have benefited from in my journey. But to meet a clinician who is using some of the most sophisticated peer support techniques, collective resilience techniques, community healing techniques in war-torn populations, in communities that have experienced disaster to promote collective healing, it warmed my heart in a way that I don't think anything has. I mean, Dr. Jack truly is one of the pioneering voices in empowering individuals to help each other heal. And that's what we talk a lot about in this week's episode. Like, we go deep into what is leaning into community to heal. How do we actually access collective resilience through each other? What's the blend of personal modulation with leaning into asking for help and being seen in community setting? How do we integrate the arts and different types of therapies to come back into harmony as communities? We believe we need each other now more than ever, and there aren't enough therapists in the world to support the growing global mental health crisis that's emerging. And so Dr. Jack's work, in my eyes, is some of the most important work that I could be bringing forth to you so that you can learn how you can lean into your communities, your families, your school environments, wherever you are in the world to create more healing for yourself. We are social creatures. We're wired to belong. And when we can come back into that remembrance as a community and truly remember that we are each other's greatest medicine, I believe that the world's going to be a better place. And so does Dr. Jack. He truly is one of my favorite human beings to have conversations with on the subject. We've had hours of conversations off the mic. And so it is just such a privilege to get an hour with him to record something on the mic so that each of you can enjoy his brilliance, his wisdom, and his heart. You can really feel that he's touched so many different communities, and the depth of research and understanding that he brings to this conversation is unparalleled. And I'm excited for you guys to get to know him in the ways that I have. So enjoy this conversation. And without further ado, here is the most amazing Dr. Jack Saul. Enjoy. Jack, welcome to the show.
Thank you for inviting me here.
I'm so grateful that we had a chance to do this. I've been really enjoying our friendship, might I add. Like, after meeting last year, it just obviously I'm a huge fan of your work and the way that you teach and some of the principles that you've brought forward into so many different communities, including the community at Liberate. So thank you for all the work you've done and the conversation you've been stewarding into the space. And selfishly, I just really, again, love you as a guy. You're just like a really funny.
Yeah, it's
fun.
been great getting to meet you, because it was so nice to see that the work that you were doing aligned so nicely with some of the framework that we've been using in psychology and working with trauma and bringing people into community and the powerful role that connection with others has in healing. And I think that you were tapping into that in your in the work that you were doing with Liberate, and it was nice to see that, and I wanted to support what you were doing.
Yeah, no, and it's totally appreciated, and I'm very interested in knowing like you're one of the first people I have actually met that was so focused on collective resilience and really bringing that conversation forward. Like, was there a moment or an experience in your career that sort of like began that fascination for you, or when did you first see the power of community and peers and collective resilience really come into play?
I just being educated in the Western mental health approach at the time that it was very individually oriented. So it kind of de-emphasized the role of community and collectives in understanding what people are going through and in looking at those contexts as very rich sources of resilience and just strengths that people could tap into that are crucial for healing. And I knew this intuitively because I grew up in a pretty tight community where most people knew each other and and kind of had their backs. And I think that that experience of growing up in that kind of context, I think, left, an impression on me that I, when I was doing the work in psychology, I felt that there was something missing in this individual approach. And it was not until I was starting to work, I think that I tapped into it, I think, first when I was on a team that was in Kosovo, working in Kosovo collaboratively with mental health professionals there after the war in 2000. And the Kosovo Albanians had no mental health system, no health system. It was an apartheid state before that. Only Serbians were allowed to have access to health, or real access. And so they had to start from scratch and develop a mental health system in Kosovo. There were 2 million people and 20 mental health professionals, psychiatrists and psychiatric residents, to take care of the whole population. And they were part of a conversation that was happening in former Yugoslavia at the time about, well, let's not go back to an over-individualized mental health system that focuses on medication only and ignores kind of the context and what's going on in families and communities. Kosovo had very strong extended families, and they decided they wanted to go in the direction of capitalizing on the strengths of those families and communities in order to promote healing in that society and build a mental health system that was resilience focused. And the idea was, people themselves carry a tremendous amount of resilience, and when you put people together in families, there's a synergy that is created from that connection and from the different diverse skills and perspectives that they bring to, their experience. And so we started with a kind of family and community resilience approach. And that's where I really learned it, because there was a person on the team, a psychiatrist, a woman, Judith Landau, who was a psychiatrist who grew up with the Zulu in South Africa. She knew a collective approach, a very indigenous approach in which people, it was just, that was the way you did things. You healed in the context of your community. There was no such thing as one person suffering. When one person suffered, the whole community suffered.
Oh,
So you needed to, the whole community needed to come together to bring the person back in, make sure that they were not going off and becoming isolated or that they were suffering by themselves. Bringing them into community is actually very healing.
well, I just want to like,
And that's what we were using, that principle there in Kosovo. And we created a very successful program that first brought families of severely mentally ill together, and what we call a multi-family psychoeducational group, maybe 8 families, and they learned to deal with the issues that their family member were presenting and keep them at home and take care of them, and then be supported by these other families that had similar situations.
so brilliant.
And that is an incredibly successful, powerful way of working on severe mental illness, garnering the strengths of all those families to work together and provide that kind of support and knowledge and sharing and problem solving together.
Well, do you feel like, I mean, one, just thank you. It's something that's just, I'm getting shivers up my spine as you're speaking, because I just feel like empowering families and communities with the tools to support one another is how we're going to solve this entire global crisis of disconnection.
Yes.
Right. And so there's this like, it's almost like we're bringing us back into the remembrance that we are each other's medicine. We are each other's, and in the medicine in belonging. Right? It's like there's like a medicinal quality to being seen by a peer, by a family member, by a friend, by a community, by someone who looks like you. And so being able to create that framework and actually bring education to it just feels so empowering. And I'm so interested in how does, have you seen in your own body of work, like one-on-one work versus this collective approach? Is there like a time to do the one-on-one versus the collective? And how do you balance both?
I mean, the most resilient context use what works. And so there are many things that work. Sometimes a more individual approach through therapy is needed. People need to go off and work on things alone. There are many situations where it's just too shameful, I think, with like maybe sexual abuse survivors. They often need to speak with one person in private in order to be able to then share with a group of other sexual abuse survivors. But the sharing with the group of survivors is actually extremely healing for them. So I think of it. That's one
In
situation.
stages. It's almost like
But
building
I
safety.
think that we're never just individuals. We're always connected and have a social context, and we always need to be aware of what the context is. If you even
Can you speak to what context, like when you say the
the
word
context, the social relationships, the environment that you're in, you're embedded in an environment, and the relationships that you have in family, in friendship network, in your community, shapes how you think and how you feel and how you behave. And for instance, I'm trained in family therapy. Early on, I did start to move in that direction of looking at larger groups and the way we need to work with them, particularly families, because we knew very early on that if you could work with a child, take them out of their family, put them in therapy every week, they could achieve some work through the therapy, or take them to a camp, a therapeutic camp, work with them. But when you put them back in the family, they're back in the same context that led to the difficulties. And sometimes the difficulties are not really the child's difficulties. The child's expressing the difficulty that the family is having. And when you start to look at family dynamics, you see that the symptomatic child who may be acting out may be the one who is crying for help for the family, because either the couple, the parents, are having some difficulty, and their conflict is being deflected onto the child. And so the child is feeling that stress and begins to act out. So the real focus of healing needs to be with the parents, actually. So that's why when you work with the whole family, you start to see that there's a larger context. That's what I mean by context, in which these problems are expressing themselves.
Feels like a root cause approach in many ways, like when you come back to context, because you're actually looking at the entire system. The family system, the community system, the socioeconomic system, like you're actually looking at all of it to then see, okay, like what is the best approach for this individual, and how can we create an environment that allows the individual to thrive? And then when you do that at a community level, it's almost like you're designing, you're architecting in some ways a fabric that empowers people to know more about each other, because when each of us understand context, we can be better friends, better stewards of each other's care, of each other's nervous systems. And is that kind of how?
I think if we just look at the individual, and there's in the trauma field, there's a lot of emphasis on helping people deal with this physiological activation, this triggering that people feel, and I know that this part of this is what this podcast is about: how to stay grounded. That's a major principle these days. But often that approach to just looking at kind of self-modulating, what we call self-modulating techniques, we're putting such an emphasis on that, we're actually not taking advantage of the social modulation that happens in groups. There was a woman I just heard yesterday talking about, it was a beautiful story about a Palestinian filmmaker who was showing her film, and there was a lot of tension in the audience and people trying to disrupt after the film was over. And she invited these people to speak and express their concern, and then she said to these people who were really overactivated, I just want to tell you that I really care about you. I love you, and I am extending myself to you, and I think that we all need to recognize the pain that we're going through, and that offer of connection there, as they're being so activated, calmed them down. And so you see this calming that can happen when another person reaches out and connects. And in that case, it was to have it from what they were being activated about, that reaching over,
the vulnerability,
and showing that. So when you have a functioning group, a group that's really working and is supportive, people do modulate each other.
It's so beautiful.
And so this is such an important part of how we stay grounded as well. And I think that the trauma field has shifted because a lot of the research is now on neurobiology of trauma. The lens has had to narrow itself because it's so complex just to understand the neurobiology. But in doing that, they're not putting on the larger lens to look at what's going on in the group and the capacities of a group to promote healing.
I mean, like, just feeling, this is something I've been really noticing in our own Liberate communities from the data we're collecting and the thousands of people we've seen now through these community-based experiences. Like, the power of feeling seen by someone. It's like there's something that just happens when when an individual has the permission to be themselves in front of another human being, knowing they're not going to be judged, knowing they're not going to be finger pointed at, know that there's not going to be something made fun of, know that they can just express and allow their shame to be seen, allow their anger to be seen, allow their frustration to be seen. That one act of kindness from another human being, just holding loving space, has such a dramatic impact on the individual's nervous system, their calm state. Like, we see the before and afters. When we see, it's like wow, like the main ingredient in helping someone feel more connected to themselves, more resilient, more grounded, is just knowing that they're not going to be judged in their authenticity by the people around them. And when they get doses of that, it does actually create a more lasting transformation, because it almost feels like it's reprogramming a set of beliefs that I got to hide myself, or I got to be a certain way, or I need to mold me to fit in. And when we start to unravel those beliefs, there's like a trickle down impact on the rest of the way that they move through their lives.
As I'm hearing you speak, I'm thinking about the question, what is the fear? What is the basic fear that activates people? You can look at the trauma field, basically is looking at, it's the fear that you're going to be harmed, that your life is threatened, that you're going to die. It's a survival fear of you as an individual. But we're social animals. I think that the ultimate fear is that you would not belong to a group, because your survival depends on the connection to a group. So when you're going through this fear, I think it has more to do with fearing that you're going to lose that sense of belonging.
Totally.
And that's what we're looking at when we try to understand collective trauma.
Yeah.
Because collective trauma is about how events, massively traumatic events, start to unravel the social fabric. That relationships, people become disconnected. They go into conflict, fragmentation. They're out of harmony. When they get out of harmony, it feels like the group is no longer providing that grounding that enables you to feel secure, to be able to survive with the group. Because our survival through our evolutionary history has been within small groups. And you always had to be in harmony in order to maximize your potential for survival. So if you're in a group that is losing that, going into disharmony, it's a survival anxiety. So we feel that when we start to feel that sense of belonging again, and that we're not so alone, then our anxiety can go down. Of course, the group can feel together the anxiety, but that's a very different kind of feeling, because they can be threatened as a group.
When someone in a group feels that disharmony, or let's say there's like a general knowing and a consensus that there's disharmony in a group field, What are the first steps that someone can take to begin to harmonize, and what does that process actually look like? Like, I guess the first step is probably awareness that they're out of harmony. And you mentioned that's in some ways like a low-level anxiety in the body or something of the sorts. But like, how does one even? Is it just bringing people together and having conversations?
I think
about it?
we groups go in and out of harmony. They actually need mechanisms to help them stabilize. And some of the most important mechanisms are kind of regular rituals that keep people acknowledging kind of their togetherness, bring people together for holidays or different religious rituals or maybe even daily rituals. But the ones that really bring a whole group together and reaffirm their identity as a group or reaffirm their basic values, then that's solidifying that can lead to promoting that harmony. And they do things together, dancing together. There's all these ways, what we call technologies of synchronization, that groups can engage in. Dancing, singing.
I'm really now interested in kind of like, I mean, you've done work in some of the most like disconnected communities, I would say, of like war-torn communities where they've experienced such depth of trauma and there's such separation. Like, is the mechanics of bringing a community like that's experienced such depth of trauma together through the same mechanisms that you're mentioning, through dance and ritual, or is it that simple, or is there something?
I mean, these cultural forms also get disrupted in major disaster, and sometimes the cultural leaders, the priest or the imams or whoever, they may be gone. Then what do you do if you don't have your cultural leader there any longer in a community to give you guidance about how to reconstitute that order in the community? And that's where then communities will call on the ancestors, because even going into relationship with the ancestors can evoke a kind of embodied wisdom that people carry. And it's never really gone. We carry that wisdom in us. Maybe even when we haven't even had exposure to much of it during our growing up, but just by virtue of being in a group, I think there's a kind of embodied knowledge that can be accessed. And I've seen these groups, like particularly indigenous groups, will call on ancestors to give guidance about what to do next. And they'll hear the indigenous, the person who is no longer here in body but is around in spirit, giving some guidance. Do these things in order to reestablish harmony in the community, in order to protect yourself. And so tapping into that traditional wisdom, I think, is extremely important. And we, it's much easier in cultures that are more collectivist oriented rather than individually oriented. But we see that capacity even in our Western over-individualized society in disasters. Because I've worked, particularly, I did a lot of work around after 9/11, the World Trade Center attacks in New York City, which took place in my neighborhood. And you see how after a crisis like this, people go into a kind of interdependence. They let down their guard that kind of separates them. We live in a society that separates us. Our institutions are not good about bringing us together and working together. So you see that after a crisis, there's actually a hormonal change where people will be more open to bonding. That's a survival mechanism. And to reduce one's tensions and conflict in order to do what's necessary to help each other. Because that's what is most adaptive in those circumstances. So, it's like we live with that capacity all the time. It's not I don't think it's a capacity that we only has to come out during a crisis. I think we have that capacity that we could actually maybe nurture to access, on an ongoing basis, and it would be really helpful for our well-being and our health.
There is something I've been realizing, like learning from crisis so that we can prevent, the disconnection. It's like crisis is in some ways the greatest teacher, for me at least. Like any personal crisis that's shown up in my life, like being able to harvest lessons and bring that into my life, and now being able to bring that forward so that I can share with other people. And it's like this cyclical nature of us learning through crisis and allowing crisis to shape us. And I'm really curious, actually, like, so I'm sad right now because I want to actually have like 6 hours with you. I want to like literally ask you so many questions about the way that you're actually personally processing some of the intensity that you're experiencing in some of these spaces. Like, whether it's 9/11, the intensity of holding that collective field, or being in war-torn communities, or working with veterans in the way that you do. Like, I'm very interested in, how are you able to actually, hold such a powerful, hold space and be able to stay in that connected state with some of these individuals as you're working with them, because it's...
Well, I have to practice when I'm preaching.
Totally.
So I need to do that in a context of other people I'm working with, peers, other professionals who are doing similar work. And I need that in order to support the work that I'm doing.
Yeah.
One of the most difficult experiences that I had working clinically was I started a clinic in New York at Bellevue Hospital for torture survivors and people suffering from refugee trauma.
Wow.
And we would have to really, in order to support their applications for political asylum, they would need to tell us like their story. And those were incredibly painful to hear what these people had been through. And, the clinicians would not sleep at night after having one of those interviews. They were so disturbing. So we had to form like a buddy system to have someone call a fellow clinician who had just been through one of these experiences, just to debrief and talk about it, not be alone with it. And that was extremely helpful to have some kind of context to support each other. But then I also, during that time, because I was interested in using theater and creating contexts where survivors could work through the arts to tell their story and bear witness to a public that didn't know what they had been through, we were exploring that. And one of the byproducts of that was that we were creating a context where we as clinicians were just working more on an egalitarian level, not less hierarchical, and we were bringing in our own experience and our own reactions and having a beautiful exchange with these survivors and working together to create theater pieces based on their stories and what they evoked in us. And wow, using the arts as a way of creating that togetherness and bringing in the creativity, because I believe very strongly that creativity is one of the greatest antidotes for trauma. When you're making something in a world where that's been destroyed, that is a very important antidote. So we used to have this workshop, theater workshops, every Friday afternoon, where the theater group would get together and we'd invite people to come. Refugees would come. They would want to tell their story. It was a really beautiful place where everyone could share, and it was just so meaningful. And I think everyone felt this kind of camaraderie, and it gave people a sense of hope.
Well, there's something about like channeling the emotions that are showing up as you're experiencing, revisiting trauma or stirring up trauma. Like, there's something about channeling that emotional energy into art that feels like you're almost giving it to like something bigger than you. Like, and I think that's something that I've found, at least in my own healing journey, just this act of surrendering myself to either music or journaling or writing or art. It's like there's something about just giving it to the ether and then letting that be carved into something beautiful that feels like it's like what nature's doing. Like when I tune out and I look at nature, like nature doesn't have an imperfection. Like something dies and something new is born in it. And so it's always in this creational cycle. So there's something really beautiful about actually honoring and recognizing that we are a part of nature. And as part of that natural way, art and creation and creativity has to be a part of us metabolizing some of these denser emotional states that are created as a result of trauma.
There's something about connecting with ways, or like nature has a kind of sense of continuity, and it's always renewing itself. And though it's going through difficulties now, there's a power and kind of a sense of immortality. I mean, there's a colleague of mine, Robert J. Lifton, talked about one of the most important processes that help people deal with what he calls the death imprint, or this very deep kind of trauma that people can feel, is being connected with some kind of symbolic immortality. In nature, it kind of as a way of connecting with a sense of immortality, or something that you're doing, trying to leave something, having children, things that go beyond your limited lifetime and is greater than yourself. That's religion satisfies that symbolic immortality as well, and that's one of the antidotes. But as we're speaking, I'm thinking, in the trauma field, there also is an emphasis on looking at these processing the difficult experiences, as one way of dealing with trauma. Tapping into the wounds that we carry and being able to metabolize them and be able to let them go. That's the dominant approach in the trauma field, but we've underemphasized, and maybe because we're not looking at the larger social and ecological context, the ways in which connection and bringing people into joy, and bringing people into collaborative creativity, doing things together, are also powerful ways of helping people deal with trauma. And there's a debate on whether those actually help people metabolize trauma as well. I work with a lot of art therapists and artists who will tell you from their experience, when people take a painful event and just find a way of expressing it symbolically or through the arts, or not in a kind of linear narrative that the trauma field would recommend, but find a way of making it meaningful through using all of the senses, through creating something beautiful, meaningful, that other people can relate to, that metabolizes the experience. But it metabolizes it in a different way. It brings it out as something that can be shared, and something that leaves one, it helps, it creates a kind of transcendence of that.
I almost find that like if I think of even I'm like trying to recall back to maybe a recent or a past sort of experience that I moved through. And it's like, if I think about how trauma or perception binds in my mind and my psyche, it's like, it's almost like it's bound in different ways, and different tools unlock different elements of it. So like there's an element of expression and art that moves the energy. And then there's an element of being seen by another person that moves the energy. And then there's sometimes a mental process, like maybe it's parts work or something that helps me see a different element of what's here. And then that moves the energy. But I sense that
That's very important what you're saying, because it is often you're moving from one thing to another.
Right.
And it's an ongoing process. And you move toward what is helpful for you next.
Yes.
Sometimes, and it could be something you hadn't tried before. And I think that's how people do this over time.
Well, it's the art of knowing yourself. I think this is why it's so, I find that like the self-work is important, but doing it like, oh, I'm going to do everything on my own, I'm independent, is almost in some ways a trauma response, right? Like I don't feel safe trusting my peers, my friends, so I'm going to hide myself and do it over here. That's not healthy. But then over-indexing on going to my partner, my friends, everyone, my therapist, it's like, I can't do this without you, in some ways is also not helpful.
So there's kind of this belief in the trauma field that you have to process the trauma before you're able to then connect and experience pleasure with others. And there's an opposing perspective that,
I hear your opposing
and the opposing perspective is that when you experience pleasure and connection with the others, you're taking a risk, and taking risks enables you to overcome some of the constriction that trauma brings. See, you're trying to get, trauma is about constricting your body. You see, people who are traumatized are constricted in their body. They're constricted in their imagination. They're constricted in their views of the world. Sometimes we call trauma the tyranny of the single narrative. They have one story they're repeating over and over again. And yet stories are very dynamic. They're always changing. And they can lose that capacity for flow of story. And then there's the constriction of one's social environment, connection. And one goes inward rather than, being able to maintain a connection with everything around one. And it's what are the things that enable you to loosen that constriction. That's why these body approaches, we've known this for decades. You bring people who've gone through a seriously traumatic experience into very kind of physical, embodied kind of movement approaches. Within a couple of weeks, they're like laughing, and their energy comes back. And when you're constrained, you're blocking the energy that you need for healing.
It's so interesting. Like, I love that you brought the word risk into play, because I remembered when you were speaking with Dan at Blue Spirit, like that was something that really stood out to me in the risk it is to share something with another. And inherently, in my eyes, risk is tied to how safe you feel. Like if you feel safe sharing something with a friend, you're not going to think it's a risk. So inherently, by you taking a risk, you're pushing the edges of safety. And I find that the safer I feel, the faster trauma just sort of solves. It's like almost like the safety is a massive ingredient in helping someone heal trauma or release it, or start to reprogram or rewire or recalibrate the nervous system so that it is more in alignment. And that's what I find is so valuable about what you're sharing, the risk that someone tastes in being seen, or sharing something before they're ready, or leaning into joy or anything with another person before they're ready to, or taking that chance. That's inherently healing because you're creating a greater capacity to feel safe.
Yeah.
And so it's
Well, you don't create trust by waiting until trust comes. You create trust by taking risk and discovering that you can trust when you take that risk in a relationship. And it's a reciprocal process with the person. And the more you take those risks and learn to trust, the more you feel that you can trust that person. I mean, this is just a part of, helping couples, deal with recovering trust. They have to take risks. There's actually no other way about it. You don't just automatically work on yourself and then arrive at trust. It's good. You need to see it enacted in the relationship in order to feel it.
Totally.
So so a lot of reconnecting to these ways that expand us, it's about going out there and doing it, and that's how we overcome the constriction.
Yeah,
Bring in, when you overcome this constriction, then you are bringing in the sources of resilience. Now, I'm defining resilience not as an individual phenomena. We tend to look at it as that internal strength or hardiness, perseverance, but resilience has always been a collective process. It's cultures carry the wisdom of the resilience of that culture, and it's learned ways of promoting that kind of collective resilience. And you can define resilience as the capacity to access capacities in your body, in yourself, in your environment, in your social, in your family relations, in your community relations, in your institutions. It's these available resources outside of you. And being able to recognize them and access them and use them is what makes you and the group that you're in a resilient group.
I think that's been one of my favorite principles that I've really learned from you, is this idea of collective resilience, and coming beyond this idea that I have to be so strong, and just remembering that there's a collective strength that you can access through your relationships, through nature, through the environment, through something bigger than you. And remembering that is a big part of actually rising your own internal resilience. But going away from this, I have to be so strong, I have to go be so, like, this me mindset, to just being more of the we. And just that simple act of expanding your awareness to include others in your collective strength is so important, and it's so powerful. And I see it every day in our community. It's like literally the principle that I feel so bullish about, and I'm so grateful that there's teachers and mentors and guides like you who are sort of pioneering this conversation, pushing it forward, and really bringing it into so many different communities and contexts. Because this one idea that our strength is so much more than what we physically define in our minds, in our hands, in our bodies, is I think what the world needs right now more than ever. And Jack,
We cannot solve the complex problems that we're facing without our collective resilience and our collective creativity. We have to bring as much as we can together. I mean, this is a big battle that we're in, and we have to use all the resources that we can, and it comes from really coming together and putting these resilient capacities together. And there's so much wisdom from different cultures on how to do this. I think that one of the principles of resilience is that you want to bring diverse perspectives in. A community that is just homogeneous will not be so resilient, but a community that has like different occupational skills, different ages of people. Older people bring the wisdom of dealing with past crises. Children bring a renewed energy and spontaneity to a community. These are all important sources of resilience.
Beautifully.
And so it's this. The diversity is extremely important. Diversity of perspectives, of different skills, of different ways of thinking. But on a global level, if we're looking at global resilience, I think we've had we have so many different cultures that have developed resilience in their particular context. Resilience is culturally defined. The type of resilience of a group, of a culture, depends on its history and its geography. It's very connected to place, because where you are determines the kind of challenges that you have to deal with. This became very apparent for me when I was working on collective resilience in Bangladesh. And their whole history of resilience had to do with dealing with floods and how to be able to recognize when they're coming in order to move. And, so the strengths that led to their survival capacities were very much defined by the particular challenges that they're facing. And that's true in a lot of different contexts. But the idea of collective resilience is very powerful in indigenous cultures that have more of a holistic ecological perspective on the connection between humans and the non-human world and nature. It's very integrated. And so it's just natural for them to think of this collective resilience of society, of humans with animals, with the plants, with nature as a whole. And and so now, as we've been expanding the notion of resilience, we're including this kind of ecological and social resilience together, where they work together.
I thought I was a fan of you before, but I'm like a super fan of you right now. Like, I just so appreciate how many different fields of experience and expertise and discipline that you're bringing into understanding this very complex and nuanced problem of developing resilience at a global level. Everything from art to nature to individual processing to group processing to there's just like, this is what I continue appreciating about your approach. It's so bottom up, really listening to different communities and seeing what works. And then from there, creating a collective narrative and a global map for how we can then bring all of these different cultures, communities, socioeconomic backgrounds together to create a web of resilience. And I just so appreciate you, Jack.
So it's not original to me.
No, totally not.
Definitely, there is a lot going on. I mean, you start to search this on the web, and you will see this is a paradigm that has been emerging.
Well, that's what's so inspiring.
And it's emerging. It's interesting. It's emerging at the same time that we are closing down, politically, and autocracies are spreading around the world, and yet there is also movement to have greater connection and greater respect for nature, and so it's really interesting that these two things are happening. I mean, probably the autocracy is partly happening because of the threat that that these capacities, which really promote more of a egalitarian, and you can you really need a more democratic process in order to bring diverse people together to work together. The principles of resilience thrive in democracy. They don't thrive in autocracy.
Jack.
So,
like, yeah, I could truly sit here with you for hours.
are we finished?
We are getting close to the end. Yeah. No,
That went very fast.
It does go fast when you're having fun, and when you're having, and again, coming back to like these principles, and everyone listening, like, whether you have experienced intense trauma or not, these principles of collective resilience are things that you can bring home into your relationships, into your families, into your workplaces, and each of us embodying this is actually the way that we create the ripple that the world needs. And Jack, again, I just want to thank you for the time, the mentorship, the friendship, and your brilliance and your devotion to this work. Like, I really feel it, and it's been such a pleasure and an honor.
And thank you for the work that you're doing, and for your appreciation, and also being kind of on the same page.
Yeah,
and that's
that's what got me so interested. Like, I remember our first kind of hang. I think we hung out for like 8 hours, and you thought I was gonna. We drove back on my quad, and it was a crazy ride back. But I just remembered that day. I was like, wow, like, it's refreshing, and really it was validating for us, because at the time, we were studying, different bodies of work to create our programs and our structures and our containers. But ultimately, like, we were figuring it out and just listening to the community, and from that space creating that resilient structure. And so then for me to meet you and for you to share so openly just that approach that you've used across the board just felt so validating, and I feel so grateful.
feels very common sense.
Right? It's like, just listen and then build and create, and just,
It's very intuitive and common sense.
Yeah. So,
And when we're teaching it around the world, it's like, oh, wow, yes, this is what we really need to be doing. Of course, we need to do it with, systematically and
and scientific rigor
and with science. Yeah. But we need to, but the basic principles are intuitively, we understand them, because we are social beings. We carry that heritage and wisdom. We all have that wisdom inside of us.
And that, to me, is what, again, if I had to wrap one thing I appreciate most about you, it's you really do believe. It's like there's a belief in just each individual having that power within them. And I find it when clinicians like are able to bring that forth in their clients and their friends and their communities, like there's a depth of like confidence that the individual builds. And so I just want to thank you again for being the type of clinician you are, and so grateful that we got to do this in Nosara while you were here. And is there anything that you're working on right now that we can bring awareness to for my community? Any, like, obviously you've got your book. We'll make links available to all your work.
I think that the new projects I'm working on would be too complicated to
not. Okay.
But people can go to my website or look me up. I put a lot of.
We'll make all.
There's some resources on resilience.
Cool.
On there, and you can read some of the articles and examples of some of these community interventions.
We'll make all of that available in the show notes. Jack, I got one last question for you.
All right.
In the midst of everything you're doing, everywhere you've been and everywhere you're going, how do you stay grounded?
How do I stay grounded?
How do you stay grounded?
By having conversations like this.
Yes. Jack is a more grounded human being right now as a result of this conversation. Oh, great. Well, thanks again, Jack, for being here. Everybody, that's a wrap.
Appreciate it.
Everybody, that's a wrap for this week's episode of Stay Grounded. I'm your host, Raj. This is your new friend, Jack. And from us, stay grounded. We'll chat soon.
Thanks for tuning into this week's episode of Stay Grounded. No matter where you're from or what you're going through, I hope it helps you remember just how incredible you are and have always been. If you're on a path of emotional healing or self-discovery and would like to learn how Liberate can support your journey, head to www.rajana.com/liberate, that is LIBER8, to learn more about our current group programs and one-on-one offerings. I love you guys, and I'll see you next week.